Your neighbor's tree blows down, and they give you the logs, and you want to turn it into usable lumber. Unfortunately, you don't know how to mill it. All you got is your trusty 14-inch bandsaw. Is that enough? Absolutely. The most important thing that you need on your bandsaw is the right bandsaw blade with a lot of tension on it. You got to have it well tensioned, you got to have the right blade. This is a 3/4 inch blade measured from the front of the tooth to the back of the blade, and there's 3 teeth for every inch. They got nice wide gullets in here under each tooth to allow the chips to get well cleared out. If you have the wrong blade on there, as I found out the hard way last week, it's going to wander all over the place and you're going to have a really bad day. You won't be able to get a straight cut. You're going to burn your wood. You might not even make it through the wood. If you're not sure what bandsaw blade to get for your bandsaw to accomplish a given task, highly recommend reach out to your trusted bandsaw blade supplier. Mine is R&D Bandsaw here in Brampton, Ontario, but whatever bandsaw blade supplier you like, reach out to them, tell them what you're trying to accomplish, and ask for advice. They'll point you at a good blade that's going to get the job done, and they'll tell you how to set it up. One thing that makes the task a lot easier is if you have miter slots in your bandsaw. I am fortunate enough to have that. And it's not just limited to a miter gauge. As long as you can make any type of a sled or jig that can ride in that, it's going to make your life a whole lot easier. I'm going to show you that sled here. There's nothing fancy here. It's a 4-foot long chunk of plywood. That's it. And then I took a little strip off of it, and I glued that little strip to the bottom. That strip rides down in the miter slot. How thick do you make that strip? That strip should be just a little tiny bit thinner than the depth of your miter slot. Why? Because if this bottoms out in the miter slot, it's going to add extra friction when you're trying to push it through, and because you want the surface here to sit flat on the table. You don't want it to be elevated up so that the whole jig, the whole sled can rock. You don't want that. When you glue it on too, you want to make sure that that's nice and straight going on there. You don't want it curved at all, because if it's curved, you're not going to be able to push it through the miter slot. Every jig needs to be kind of slippery to be able to slide nicely across the surface of your table. So highly recommend putting on a coat of paste wax. I use Minwax, but there's lots of brands out there. And I just apply that liberally to everything. Something else I should mention that I did, you'll notice the staining on the wood here. That's because I used CA glue to put this on. Now there's a lot of ways you could put it on. You could put it on with wood glue. Some people might do glue and screw. I had CA glue on hand, so that's what I used. But because I used CA glue, this was rough. So I dressed this all with sandpaper to make it nice and smooth. That together with the paste wax, it slides great in the miter slot. Here is the sled sitting in the miter slot. Slides nicely. Now, if we look at here, there's a gap. Doesn't matter how much that gap is. It's just good to have a little bit of a gap. You don't want it to be too big. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a log, and we're going to screw that down to this jig. And any chunk of the log that we want cut off, we'll have it hanging over on this side of the blade, right? So then, when we take the sled and we push it through, the bandsaw will take a very straight, very perfect cut off the edge of that log to give us a flat face. Exactly the point of the jig. Now you might look at your log and you might say, well, my log is fairly straight here. Okay. And you might say, well, I've got a fence. Why don't I just freehand hold it? I don't need to build a jig. I can just push the log through by hand. Don't do that. Just don't do that, okay? What's going to go wrong free holding? Well, you got a bandsaw blade that's coming down. It's constantly pushing down. And this is a rounded thing. Now, what do rounded things like to do? They like to rock and they like to roll. So by having the bandsaw blade constantly push down, this log is going to want to twist to whichever side the bandsaw blade is on. You're not going to get a straight cut. The other thing is you're now applying twisted, uneven tension to your bandsaw blade. So you've got a big beefy bandsaw blade, you've got wood, which is incredibly tough, and you've got a 1 3/4 horsepower motor. They're all fighting to figure out who's going to win. It doesn't matter which one of them wins. In that situation, you're going to lose. You're going to have a really bad day. Let's get ready to mount the log. I took this sled and I flipped it around 180 degrees and put it back down in the miter slot. Now you see a gap here. The reason you see a gap is because this is not centered. Doesn't matter if it's centered or not, it's just on mine it's not. But I turn it around so that I could put the log on, and this is the edge where we're going to do the cutting. So we can put the log on here. So by turning it around, I've moved it out from underneath all these parts of the bandsaw that would get in the way. So it makes it a lot easier to pick up a log and plop it down and screw it in from the bottom. That's exactly what I'm going to do. One note is that I've actually clamped this down, because if I put a log on here without it clamped down, the whole jig is just going to like flip over and who knows what, hit me in the face, fall on my feet. I don't really want that to happen. I've set the log on the jig, and right now I'm trying to figure out how much of this edge I want to take off. Because this is only about 2 millimeters away from the blade, this shows approximately where it would get cut off. You might look at that and think, well, there's some good usable wood in there. I want to take as much of that wood as possible. Can't we make a shallower cut? Can't we just take a little bit off? Okay, well, what we're going to do, we're actually going to make a cut here, and then we're going to take it off and put it back on the jig the other way on, and then take a cut over here. And that's going to give us 2 faces at 90 degrees. Then we take it off of the jig completely, and we're going to be using the flat table of the bandsaw and the fence of the bandsaw for our subsequent cuts. So if you only took a little bit off, the same problem that we talked about earlier with it rocking, the same thing could happen. So we want to make sure that we've got a nice wide face for that to run on the table of the bandsaw. There is my log screwed to the jig. Now, come around, we'll see that there are some screw holes. I should take a little bit of those splinters out. If I was smart, I would have countersunk those holes. In fact, I did with some of the holes I used on a previous cut, but I think it'll be okay. I've used a couple of these guys, 3.5-inch decking screws. I find they give a really good bite. I could probably put a third one in, and maybe I will. As a side tangent, if I had one recommendation, it's to get a friend or, a teenage child to help you, to lift the log onto the sled, to lift the sled and the log down, to help you lift it up to make the cut on the bandsaw, because, man, this is green wood, wet wood. It is heavy. Woo! And look at the results. Nice, flat, straight. This is going to reference beautifully against the table of the bandsaw. And here's the offcut. You know what? You might look at that and you might say, I still don't like how much wood was wasted there. Well, you know what? You cut this up and you nail it to your outdoor garden planter. You go all the way around the edge and you got something that looks very rustic and very trendy, very fashionable. So even these chunks of bark don't have to go to waste. I really could have used some help lifting that onto my bandsaw. Wow. I'm actually amazed at how nice of a surface is on this too, just coming off of a 3-tooth blade. Oh, there's a little bit where I started. There's a little bit where I finished, again, because there's a little bit of racking and movement at the beginning and end because the jig isn't tight, because my table's only so big, but it does a really good job right off the saw. All right, I've turned the log around, and now this is where we cut last time. It's sitting on top of the jig. We have to decide, do we want to cut this off, or do we want to cut this side off to make our 90-degree perpendicular other reference face? You can see this side is a little chewed up. I've got a branch here. There will be a knot in here somewhere. And because this is linden wood or basswood that I'm going to use for spoon carving, I don't really want the knots in there. I want very straight, true grain. So I've chosen this to be the side that I'm going to cut off. If I was going to maybe turn a bowl with it, maybe that knot would be interesting, but not so much for spoon carving. I'm going to take this side of it. Once again, we have to decide how much we're going to cut off. The nice thing is, because we've already got a flat face, if we just get this lined up where the edge of this is here, as long as it's going to take enough off up here, we're good. But we just really need the 90-degree thing. So that is enough there. And now I come down to this end, and I'll do the same here. I'll just push it over, and that'll probably be about fine. Now, if we look in the middle here, you know, there's going to be a little bit of it that it doesn't quite get to. There will be this little tiny radius of bark. That's going to be okay, because it's going to be a very small amount, and we're still going to have two very big, stable reference faces riding against the fence and the table. And there we go. Two 90-degree perpendicular flat faces to reference on the table and the fence. Yeah, got a little thin here. There's a little bit of a radius in there. I suppose I could have had it slightly further over, but it's going to be perfectly fine for our purposes. This here, there's a lot of surface area for this to ride up against the fence, and I am going to have it this way on as I'm sawing it. So, once again, another lovely offcut that can be nailed onto an outdoor project. Keep a little brush handy. Even with the dust collector running, there's still a lot of dust that gets left on here. And it's just good to take it off, because it'll probably slide better across the table. In fact, even with the dust collector, there's my table. You don't have to check it with a square, but it's nice to know that it is approximately square. Oh, not good enough for, you know, bench planing something to jointed perfection, but for rough cut lumber, pretty amazing. Now we're done with the sled. That's all done. You set up your fence, and if your fence is changeable like mine is, you want it to be in the tall mode, because you want as much of the wood up against the fence as possible, and the other, of course, reference face riding against the table of your bandsaw. You also get to decide how thick you want it to be. In my case, I've set it up for 1 inch thick. Now you decide. When you dry this, it's gonna air dry, or if you're fortunate enough to have a kiln, you're gonna toss it in a kiln. Okay, but it's gonna shrink. So I'm starting off with 1 inch. I don't know, am I gonna end up with 7/8 thick when I'm done? And if I'm gonna end up with 3/4, I don't think it's gonna shrink that much. That would be extreme, but you're gonna lose some there. As well, your wood's probably going to bow, cup, twist, warp. It's going to deform somehow, you know, just to some degree. Hopefully not too much, but a little bit. So if you're going to run it across a jointer, you're going to take material off of it. If you're going to run it through a thickness planer, you're going to take material off of it, right? So if you care about the thickness, the final thickness, once you've surfaced it after it's dry, you want to start with something that is thicker than what you need to account for all of those things. In my case, I'm just carving spoons, so 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch, 1/2 inch, I don't care, anything works. That's everything that I wanted to show today about building a sled and using it to get those two perpendicular reference faces. From here, I'm going to resaw off camera. It's just your standard resawing operation, and then I'm going to sticker it and put it outside to air dry. I may at some point make a couple more videos. I might show the process of resawing, stickering, leaving it to air dry. You never know. Maybe I'll build a solar kiln someday. Hard to say. But for now, I hope this was helpful. I hope it gets you those two perpendicular faces, and I hope it saves you some of the grief that I went through when I had the wrong bandsaw blade. Cheers. Happy woodworking. And there are 4 lovely, rough sawn, inch thick boards.